Welcome to Science on Tap, Minocqua. My name is Susan Knight. I work up at UW Trout Lake Station. And Science on Tap is an example of the Wisconsin idea, where the borders of the university are the borders of the state. We try and get ideas all throughout the state. We started Science on Tap not to be a lecture or to be a PowerPoint presentation, but to introduce new science ideas and to get everybody a chance to ask questions themselves so that you could get some feedback and ask your own questions. It's a lot more fun that way. I want to remind you about our partners at Science on Tap. There's Trout Lake Station, where I work, Kemp Natural Resources Station, but the Minocqua Public Library, and the Lakeland Badger chapter of the Wisconsin Alumni Association, and of course our hosts here, the Minocqua Brewing Company. And also we are funded largely by the Brittingham Fund at the University of Wisconsin, so thanks to them. And as always, there are 4 ways to watch. We have, you can watch right here where you all are. You can go to the library where Mary Taylor is live streaming the presentation. And we have had a couple of others sign on for live streaming. The Aqualand Ale House up in Boulder Junction is streaming, as is, we understand, the Eagle River Library. So a number of places you can go. Also, you can watch right from home. So if you're a snowbird and you find yourself far away in the middle of February, you can still watch us live. And then we also archive all of our presentations so you can watch them a couple of weeks later. And we also make a 5 to 10 minute short version, a few minutes of the speaker and then a few minutes of questions that you can get just a flavor of the presentation. So lots of ways to enjoy Science on Tap. Our next Science on Tap will be a little different. It'll be February 7th. And our topic will be the land ethic and deer with Tim Van Deelen. Tim actually spoke here quite a number of years ago with Don Waller talking about deer and forests. And Tim does a lot of work with deer, and he also works somewhat with wolves. And but also, it's going to be kind of a combination where we're also going to encourage everybody. You might remember that a few years ago there was a MOOC, a massive open online course on the land ethic and Aldo Leopold, and it was really terrific. And maybe you saw it the first time around, but what we're doing is we're trying to encourage you to watch a few of those videos, and we're highlighting 4 of the videos. They should take about 40 minutes if you watch all of them. And Tim Van Deelen's talk will be very much sort of talking about land ethics and the use of and how we use our land. So that'll be an important part. And so just another opportunity for you to take another look at those videos if you never saw them for the first time, or to revisit them. So that should be good. And we'll send out an email with those links, or you can go to our website and see, and we'll have the videos linked there. So I hope you can get a chance to do that. Also, next month is our 5th anniversary of Science on Tap. Yeah, pretty amazing. So it's been So that'll be fun. So how do we celebrate Wisconsin events? Ice cream. Yes, you've already got beer and cheese here, so we don't need to bring that in. But we will bring up some Babcock ice cream for everyone next time. Sorry, not this time. So yeah, he'll have to come back. Okay. So I think we've got all of that business out of the way. Tonight, we are most fortunate to have Paul DeLong, Senior Vice President for the American Tree Farm System and Conservation at the American Forest Foundation. These organizations strive to keep forests healthy and to sustain wood supplies. He works with a team of conservationists to administer the 20 million acre tree farm program and implements projects on family-owned forest lands designed to protect drinking water, wildlife, and sustainably produced wood products across the country. And prior to joining the American Forest Foundation, Paul was the Wisconsin State Forester for 13 years with the Wisconsin DNR, so he knows Wisconsin extremely well and the upper Midwest. Paul was born and raised in Ohio And though his mother came from Wisconsin. So of course he spent all of his vacations here. So he got a real good taste of Wisconsin early on. He reports he was drawn to forests and forestry at a young age, and he never wavered. So though his family didn't really camp or hunt or hike or fish, he still got the bug to spend as much time in natural places as he could. He got his bachelor's degree in forestry from the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point and a master's degree in natural resource policy from University of Michigan. Before taking his current position, Paul was Wisconsin's chief state forester and headed the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources Division of Forestry. He has spent considerable time in the Northwoods over the last 25 years, both for work and play, and he's especially partial to autumn. So here's your trivia question. While a college student, Paul worked one summer for the Mosinee Paper Company. He was helping to log an aspen stand in Vilas County near Fence Lake, just down the road here. Paul was standing by when his buddy suddenly cut Paul in the face with a chainsaw, almost taking off his head. How did this happen? Okay, A, the other guy got the chainsaw stuck in a tree, and as he yanked it out, he swung it back and nailed Paul right in the face. Or B, while the other guy was chainsawing, a porcupine scampered down the tree, scared the guy to death, who jumped back from the tree and hit Paul in the face. Or C, Paul was criticizing the other guy's chainsaw technique, and the other guy got so ticked off, he decided to illustrate his chainsaw art skills on Paul's face. It was A. Got the saw stuck in the tree. All right, so I give you Paul DeLong.
Thank you, Susan. Didn't quite nearly take off my head. However, I was really glad I didn't hear a lot of C's, because some people might look at this face and say, oh, it was definitely C. So it's a pleasure to be here this evening, and appreciate you coming in from the cold. And I've always wanted to be able to speak at a bar. And I've spoken in a lot of locations and whatnot, but I'm pretty sure this is by my recollection, this is my first time in a bar, and I think I can get used to this. So, as you heard my introduction, and the fact that I'm with the American Forest Foundation. How many of you have heard before that introduction and heard of the American Forest Foundation? Okay, some people. Got people raising beers. I feel like we should toast now. So, a lot of people don't know of the American Forest Foundation by name. Some people who aren't close within the forestry community may not know the name, although they often know the program, or at least, even if they can't name the program specifically, they are at least aware of, by seeing as they're driving down the road, those green and white signs that say, right now they could either say Certified Family Forest or American Tree Farm. So how many of you have heard of the Tree Farm program? Okay, a lot more hands go up. So it's like BASF. If you remember BASF, they had those advertisements, we are not, the products you use, we make the products you use better. Remember that? Never understood why they spent so much money trying to get them to be aware, since they didn't sell directly anything. But it was the whole idea of AFF is kind of what's behind a program like the American Tree Farm System. But the mission of AFF is all about family-owned forest land and about sustaining America's family-owned forest land so that it can be enjoyed by current and future generations. Now, one might ask the question, why do we care about family forest-owned lands? Did you ever wonder that? So, are they that really significant? I mean, after all, we've got a fair amount of public land, right? Public forest land, and we have large industrial lands. So why should we care about family-owned forest lands? It's a lot of it, yep. There's quite a bit of it. In fact, it's the majority. If you look at the number one category of forest ownership in this country, it's actually individual and family-owned forest land. So in spite of all the debates, the thrust and parry that occurs about public land particularly federal lands, particularly in the West, where it's a dominant land, the land ownership. In much of the country, private lands dominate ownership. And so it's easy to look over those lands and what they might mean. But there's a second reason, I think, to be thinking about family-owned forest lands specifically. And that is, yes, they represent the majority of forest ownership, or the largest in the plurality in terms of largest single category. Also, in places in the majority of the country, Wisconsin, they're also the absolute majority of ownership of forest land. So how many acres of forest land do we have in this state? Let me ask a different question. What percentage of our state is forested? Is it 25%? Is it roughly half? Is it 3/4? 68. Wow, you're very specific. Point two? Yeah. Anybody else? See, you're Northwoods folks, right? You see forests a lot. You ask this question in southern Wisconsin, number goes down dramatically. Aren't we America's dairy land? How many cows do you see roaming in the woods? We don't need to get into that right now. Okay? We're America's dairy land, right? People put cheese heads on their head. They don't put fur heads on. So, but roughly half the state is forested. And it's been going up. And in fact, we have more forest land in Wisconsin than we do agricultural land. So, although agriculture is a really important aspect and component of our state's economy, and we think of the pastoral landscape of going by farms and whatnot, we actually have more forest land than we do ag land in this state. And when you look at our forest land, it's all 17 million acres of it, and we think about the fact that, do we have some robust public lands in this state, forest lands? Yeah, we do. My goodness. Have you looked around here? Yeah, we have some really phenomenal, excellent public forest lands in the state. We've got the largest single ownership of public lands is in the county ownership. We have state forest lands. We've got federal forest lands, tribal lands as well. So we've got a lot of rich ownership of forest lands in the state. And yet, the majority of our forest land in Wisconsin is owned by individuals and families. So, again, why should we care? We got our public forest lands. We can recreate on those lands. They produce sustainably grown forest products. Why do we care what happens on those forest lands? Well, what benefits do you and I get from somebody else's forest land? Clean air, yep, clean water. Wildlife habitat, a whole diverse array of wildlife habitat. And the list can go on of benefits. Tax revenue? Yeah, we're going to get into that. All right. So when you think about the forest land in the state, and the family-owned forest lands in the state, if we were, even in parts of the state which have a predominance of public land, if you were to start to erase the privately owned forest land, do you think it would have an impact? And would that impact be positive or negative on things like wildlife habitat, on clean water, on clean air, etc.? Yeah, it would be negative. So as we think about the debates that go on about forest policy and practices, a lot of that debate gets focused on public lands. And it's understandable, that's the public's land, and therefore there's lots of public dialogue about that. Often, at least particularly with the general public, below the radar screen in many ways is what's happening with that private forest land. So, although the majority, 9 million acres of our forest land in this state are owned by individuals and families, do you think the trend has been that 9 million plus acres is owned by fewer people or more people than 30 years ago? More people. So the average parcel size is declining. Because one of the tendencies, of course, over time is land can get parcelized, we would say. It gets split. It can be because a number of different reasons. Land might go to the next generation and they don't keep it together, so it gets split apart. Land gets sold off because bills need to be paid, and so a portion gets sold off. And lots of different reasons that happens. But when we think about the public benefits that derive from those forest lands, are they enhanced? Are they easier to accrue as a public from larger or smaller parcels? Larger parcels. So one of the challenges we have is as the number of private landowners increases, the average parcel size decreases, and it becomes ever more difficult to realize the full potential of those lands to produce benefits. So what is the American Forest Foundation doing about that? Well, one of the things that we do is by engaging private landowners. And of course, the American Tree Farm System is a 77, it'll turn this year-old program in which in 42 different states, there are programs whereby landowners have access to expertise, resource professionals, they get access to information, help them manage their land. But something that the American Forest Foundation started a half dozen years ago, and actually started it right here in Wisconsin, is an effort to look at how can we be more intentional about identifying priority places and trying to really increase and move the needle on engagement of private landowners and management of that land. In addition to the work we do in a broadcast way through things like the American Tree Farm System. So a pilot project was undertaken with a number of partners, including the state of Wisconsin, to look at, are there ways in which we can really target landowners in specific places and increase the rate at which we can get landowners to actively engage. And by actively engage, what that means is that a landowner develops first an understanding and awareness about what they have. They then move to understanding about their land, okay? And that's all in the context of what are the benefits that I want to achieve from my land as the individual landowner. It's private land. So it's about achieving their benefits and their goals and objectives, but doing so in a way that sustains the ability of that land to produce benefits long term. So whether my primary interest is in wildlife, whether my primary interest is in scenic beauty, whether my primary interest is in financial return, whatever that might be, how can I do that and do that in a way that assures the ability of that forest to continue to produce a suite of benefits in the long run. So as we look at engaging landowners, when we begin that project in the driftless part of Wisconsin, it was trying to look at what can we use based on what we've learned about landowners and information that's available about landowners to try to reach them in new ways. Those of us who've been engaged in forestry a long time, working with private landowners has been a long time practice. It's been a quest to increase and maximize the amount of private forest land that's sustainably managed. So this is not new, but there's new technologies that are available now. There's readily available information that can tell us more about landowners and what their interests are. And so can you reach landowners based on what their specific interests are? We now have the advent of social media. And how might social media be a tool, an avenue by which to get the attention of landowners? Because as we know, landowners, we all in our lives, right, have more distractions than ever, right? There's information coming at us all the time, okay? Some of you might be successful at ignoring most of that information, but at the end of the day, when we have information, we want to get to landowners. How do we get landowners to say, ooh, that's of interest to me, I want to learn more? And so that's something that we've been working on as an organization as we target key places of going in and identifying how can we reach landowners in key places to achieve those outcomes. So we also decided as we implemented that project and then looked to take it elsewhere to see if it works in southwest Wisconsin, might it work as well in the piney woods of Mississippi? Might it work as well in the Blue Hills of Oregon in a very high fire risk landscape? Might it work as well in New England? And so we started to do projects in different places. We also recognize that the issues that in different parts of the country are really significantly different. And so the approach in terms of how to reach landowners and what is it that would be most valuable for landowners to do in a particular place. Where is there a particularly compelling public interest such that there will be those who would be willing to invest in work that gets done on private land because of the benefits produced. So in the West, what we did and did an assessment and found that even though it's a public land-dominated landscape, 1/3 of critical water supplies actually the acreage that from which those waters flow is actually private land, even in a landscape that's dominated by public land. So, targeting key watersheds where there's predominance of private land as a way of complementing work that's done on public lands to reduce fire risk and thereby protect water supplies. In the southeast part of this country, we found that there are over 500 forest-dependent wildlife species that are at risk, either already listed as threatened or endangered or candidates for listing. And that's also a huge wood basket for not just this country, but for the world in terms of the production. And so here you had this tension in a landscape that's very, very much dominated by private land. So for example, Georgia, 91% private land. Okay, Wisconsin, okay, 70% of our land is private. So we have 30% public ownership. They have only less than 10% public ownership. So they can't rely, these species will not be protected by simply doing work on public land. So it required reaching out to private lands. And so it was actually putting at risk, ironically, both a huge sector of the economy as well as the habitat itself. And private landowners were very wary of engaging with government in protection of those species, not because they don't care about wildlife. In fact, they overwhelmingly do care about wildlife, but they're very wary of government tying their hands. And so we've been doing work in the South by demonstrating that landowners can do things to help restore key ecosystems in a manner that allows and enhances production of forest products, as well as protects at-risk wildlife species, creating a great win-win and helping landowners feel safe in doing that work, that they won't be penalized later on if something gets listed. And in the northeast part of the country, we completed an assessment that came out last year that looked at the fact that a huge chunk of those forests are all roughly middle-aged. There was both a lack of young forest as well as a lack of older forest characteristics. And so working with private landowners to enhance wildlife habitat by featuring both of those, both of which can benefit from targeted sustainable management. And in doing so, we're working with organizations like the Audubon Society, getting landowners who really care about birds to engage and implement practices on their land that improve habitat for birds, for example, and a number of others. So now we're back in the upper Midwest, and we're doing an assessment of the upper Midwest, specifically Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan, and looking at what are the key themes going to be here. What are we going to focus on here in terms of looking at the important role that private forest lands here play, and a way in which we can identify entities who would be willing to invest resources, whether that's like out west in the circumstance where you get water utilities willing to make investments to reduce fire risk to protect their water supplies, because the cost once a fire goes through to recover from those from a water supply standpoint it's phenomenal. It's the size of that cost. In the South, you've got entities interested in investing because they care deeply about maintaining the important part of the rural fabric through a forest-based economy, and they're really concerned about what happens if work isn't done to help both protect those species and continue to produce forest products. You get brands like Procter & Gamble, for example, and 3M, both huge manufacturers of products that we all use that are forest-based, and their interest is in demonstrating that they walk the talk of sustainability, and they want to invest in that work because they see it again as a win-win. So again, identifying here, what are the key things, the key public outcomes that we see these family-owned forest lands can provide, and then how do we bring resources to bear and work with local partners and organizations to help implement and do outreach to landowners to get more landowners to actively engage and do good sustainable management. So that's our orientation as we move forward. So finally, and then I'll open it up for questions. One of the things that we recognize as we think about private forest lands and the fact that we all benefit from what private forest owners do on their land, and we all can suffer the consequences by what they do as well. And so that's where we have a collective social interest in what happens on these lands. I think it's part of what compels thoughtful dialogue about how might we make investments as a collective society in work that can, yes, achieve benefits to a private landowner, but in doing so assures benefits that we all achieve ultimately going forward. So in a place like Wisconsin, we have a $25 billion forest products industry, one of the top in the country. And when you look at this region of the state, you see a forest-based economy that's based on both wood products and recreation and tourism. And there are a lot of folks who would say those two can't work together, and yet we've shown in places like this they can actually work well together. And when I'm in other parts of the country where you have one or the other but not both, they're much more, they struggle to a much greater degree than here. And with all the debates that have occurred about rural economies, rural communities and whatnot, I think my observation would be forest-based economies in places like this offer an incredible opportunity. And so we can't take them for granted, though, and we can't just simply expect that those are simply going to rely on what happens on public lands, because I believe it's going to take both public and private lands being well managed to produce the set of benefits economically, ecologically, and socially that is a win-win for not only individual landowners, but the public at large.
I am seeing an awful lot of logging trucks this winter. Has there been a big increase in logging this winter?
I can no longer really speak directly to increase in logging this winter, though I see several people in this room who can speak to that.
Anyone?
No one wants to speak
Would
to
anyone like to speak to that? I'm looking at you
Crickets.
back here.
Crickets. By the way, what I will say
Oh,
is...
we got a
Oh,
taker.
Tom Hiddle is going to do that? Awesome.
So at least it's been my observation that one of the reasons we're seeing a lot of trucks here recently is that this is the first good solid snap of cold weather that we've had in a couple of seasons. So with the cold weather, we're able to access some areas that otherwise we normally wouldn't be in.
Do you have statistics of the demographics of the age of these owners of this land? Because it seems to me that the generations are getting older that own the land. It's not the younger generation.
Yeah, great question. There are demographics about ownership of land, and not surprisingly, landowners tend to be an older demographic. However, there is turnover happening, and something that we had identified about a decade ago in Wisconsin was we saw this pending intergenerational transfer based on a huge slug of ownership of land at the more mature age groups, and saw that transfer that was going to occur. And like anything, it's not like there's a momentous occasion and suddenly the transfers occurred, right? It sort of keeps happening to the point at which now a lot of that transfer has happened and will continue to happen, but a huge slug of it has actually already occurred. Now, I believe the statistic is 45% of the private forest land in this country is now owned by people under 55 years of age. I hope I got my fives right there. I think that's right. And that surprises a lot of people because they think of it as a much older demographic. There's still a huge slug of land owned, right? But that churning keeps happening. And so, for example, when we started looking at use of social media to reach landowners, one of the comments made is, oh, that generation, landowners don't use social media, you know, because that's an older demographic and whatnot. And there's two things about that. A, that statistic I just gave you helps us sort of recognize the fact that there's a huge chunk of land owned by folks who are, you know, come from a generation that's more used to social media. But the second issue is older generations actually do use social media at a much higher rates than maybe people have thought about. And one of the driving forces we found, for example, our grandchildren are an incredible motivator for certain folks to be on social media. Whatever the reason, we have found that when landowners have come through, for example, a Facebook test that we've done, it's the demographics of landowners who do that are very similar to the demographics of landowners overall. So in other words, it doesn't bias against older landowners. So I expect we're still going to see, generally speaking, landowners are going to be of an older category, but that churn keeps happening to the point at which that turnover is occurring and will continue to occur.
Hi. My family has owned 110 forested acres in Pennsylvania since the early 1770s, and it's still 110 acres by some miracle. And when my sister and I inherited it, we thought, wow, there must be something different to do. So this is a little bit of a story of not just an age group, but, you know, from one generation to the next. As I said, it was in Pennsylvania, so I went on to the PA state government thing, forestry department, and found out that this wonderful thing called the stewardship plan existed, and they actually gave you a leg up. Something like almost 100% of the drawing up of the plan of your acreage was paid by the state. And then you would, from then on, it would be your responsibility to go forward. But it was an amazing experience because there's a whole new generation of ecologically trained stewardship foresters out there, just waiting for us to, want to be engaged with them. And it was the most truly intricate and kind of consuming experience to see, how many species we had, where they were located, and so forth. So, just long story short, it pays to go out there and explore and see what's out there.
Yeah, thank you for that story. And although about Pennsylvania, one of the things I would offer some insight as it relates to Wisconsin is when you look around the country, so I mentioned the chunk of private-owned forest land. So there's about 260 million or so acres of family-owned forest land in the country, all right? And of that, just a little over 10% of that land has a management plan associated with it, all right? So your experience there is really different than that. It's a minority. Wisconsin actually leads the nation in the percentage of private-owned forest land that has a plan. And it's more than double the national average. And why that is a couple of different things. One, our managed forest law and forest crop law, the tax law programs in this state, have been very successful in engaging private forest owners. And that's been really critically, I think, important for a bunch of different reasons. But one of the things that results from that is a requirement of a management plan that is part of that, being part of that program. The second thing is that there's been a really good and I think effective symbiotic relationship in this state with the public investment at the state level in private forestry, recognizing its importance, and private sector investment in this work. And they can work really well together, and the symbiosis comes from the fact that public investment to work with landowners, to reach landowners, to help them through that stage of moving from awareness to ultimately understanding, and then ultimately making a decision about taking action on their land. In the private sector, if you think about the private sector engagement, ultimately that has to come with it the ability to get paid for services, right? So a landowner is often very wary early on about paying for something because they're not necessarily familiar with. And even though we'd say, boy, landowners are aware of if you don't do plumbing, you hire someone to do plumbing, right? The idea that something you don't know, you might want to invest in somebody who does. We haven't typically treated woods that way. And although it's a really good investment to hire a professional forester to help you with management of your land, a lot of folks are wary of doing that. So the state of Wisconsin, for a long, long time, put a significant investment in working with private forest owners. And then also helped grow a private sector a cooperating consulting forester program that has helped, I think, increase the overall number of professional assistance available to landowners. And a good investment at the front end gets landowners interested who can then be turned over to get assistance from resource professionals in the private sector, and that can sort of build on itself. So Wisconsin's been very fortunate that way, and I've certainly gone to other states where they've really struggled, and they have not, you see the results in terms of what it does and does not go on private lands because of a lack of investment. So really kudos to Wisconsin for recognizing the importance of these lands and recognizing the importance of making an investment in those lands because of the public benefits that ultimately accrue as a result.
We have a question online.
Yes, a question from the library. How much of forest in Wisconsin is old growth, and of that total, how much is private? And does your organization do anything to preserve old growth stands?
I don't recall offhand what percentage of our forest land. It's a very relatively small percentage of forest land in the state is old growth, and there's robust debates of even how you define old growth. How much of that's on private land? Very little of it is on private land. And then the last part of that question, What do we do as an organization? So part of working with private landowners, and this is true even not just with American Forest Foundation and others, but again, getting a resource professional, working with a private landowner. When you see special resources, part of that's helping a landowner understand what is unique and special about what they have. And some landowners may not have very much that's unique or special, maybe even anything, but there are landowners who do, and sometimes they don't recognize what they have. And so that's, again, the benefit of a resource professional who can help finding a relic stand, for example, and making sure to do work to help protect that stand, distinct from maybe other parts of that forest that are not in that sort of special condition. And so, again, by promoting working with private forest landowners, helping them understand what they have and understand what the interest of those landowners is. And again, if you think about landowners, most landowners take great pride in having something that's special or unique. And so helping that landowner see and understand what they have that is special or unique can really help a landowner then appreciate what they can do to help make sure that what is special or unique about it can be preserved.
A question back here?
Yeah, I've had a question about Wisconsin's managed forest law program. I know there have been some significant changes recently, and I'm wondering what the future of the program is, specifically because I've heard the changes have made it more restrictive as to what the landowner can actually do with his land.
So, I really probably am not the person who should speak to the managed forest law, as I am, no longer responsible for the program. So I won't overtly answer that question, and we'll certainly leave it to, there's some folks, if there's a desire, maybe even afterwards, you can get some additional information about that. I will say this more generally, though. I think there have been a lot of debates about the program in the state, and what to me is important is to recognize that having a robust, attractive program and balancing the interests of what is the public's investment in a program like that, and what is the benefit. So what is it attractive for a landowner to get part of? Why would a landowner want to be part of it, right? Because any program like that is going to come with restrictions, right? There are going to be constraints. It's sort of an agreement that if you're willing to do X, here's what you get in return. So there's been lots of debates about what the appropriate balance point is for what the level of investment should be, and then what the benefit of that is. And so that's something I think is going to be an ongoing issue of looking at how do we balancing out what that looks like. What I hope never gets lost in that is the real, again, my belief that there's incredible value in assuring that we sustainably manage and maintain in forest these private forest lands. And so I would say my bias is to fall on the side of making sure that we have a program that the public is willing to invest in so that we can continue to have, again, lands much exceeding the national average that are in a program that have some assurance that they're going to be well managed for many years to come. So that's where my bias is.
A question here?
Yeah, we've got public, public land and private land. And we seem to be growing in things called Nature Conservancy land, and there's a myriad of other names. So is that kind of a public-private hybrid? And do those people manage their lands, or do they let them stay the way they are kind of forever?
So I can speak specifically to, like, there are Nature Conservancy-owned lands, for example, and the Nature Conservancy, which is a national nonprofit organization, similar to AFF, but in terms of being a broad conservation organization. But Nature Conservancy, which part of their portfolio or part of what they do is conserve land through ownership. It's not the only thing they do. They do a number of things, and they're a good partner of AFF's. But land that they own, they do actively manage their land. And again, what that active management looks like depends on what it is that's the special features of that land and how you best protect and conserve those features. So, in other words, what that translates to is their management of land may involve everything from burning to timber harvest, The key will be in answer to the question of why you're doing that particular practice right now. It's to achieve a specific outcome with respect to the ecological condition of that land. And so, one of the things we had there have been robust debates about, and I think there's been a real evolution in the debates about forestry, certainly in my career, is when I started, I felt there was a much sharper divide between the idea of you either manage forest land or you protect forest land. And it was sort of the idea that managing it's an economic construct and protecting it is an ecological construct. And the reality is that to achieve ecological outcomes, there are a whole range of actions that might be appropriate in any given circumstances. And so we moved away from the artificial divide that somehow you're not doing ecologically good things if you're actually actively managing the land. I think we've shown how we can actually use active management to enhance features, even enhancing old growth characteristics, for example, which 30 years ago would have been considered that's an oxymoron. The reality is there are ways in which one can actively manage a forest, and by how it's managed, you can actually enhance the set of conditions that are some of the attributes of old growth that are attractive. Okay, and so I think we've learned a lot, and we will continue to learn a lot about how forests function, and so it becomes the issue of what's the purpose, what are the set of objectives for this land, and then what does that suggest to us in terms of how that land can be managed to achieve those objectives, whether that's in a Nature Conservancy type ownership or whether that's a family-owned forest landowner who says, my primary interest is wildlife, and the issue is what kind of wildlife are you particularly interested in? And that may then dictate what kind of practices you implement and when you implement those practices. So the idea of you can manage for any number of outcomes on forest land.
Question here?
Is there a minimum acreage that requirement to get you guys involved, or?
Yeah, so like when I give statistics like 9 million acres of forest land, I should point out in fairness that there's sort of a debate even about when is a parcel, if I own an acre of land and it's mostly forested, is that what we mean by family-owned forest land? And under some definitions, there are stats about how much of that land there is. But 10 acres has really been something that both American Forest Foundation uses, and actually, the state of Wisconsin has long used, for example, in terms of often defining what a sort of 10 acres and up is a basis of thinking about the definition of forest land. But in fairness, someone owns 5 acres of woodland, that's still forest land, and it might be family owned. It's just at some juncture it becomes ever more difficult in terms of achieving specific outcomes on smaller parcels. Part of the work we do too that relates to this issue is looking at the opportunities for how can we, in areas like in a project that's occurring in Massachusetts and Connecticut, where their idea of a big plot of forest land is really different than what we would consider here, right? And about the ways in which you can help consolidate and bring together landowners to work collectively so the effective size of what you're managing becomes larger. And there have been discussions even in Wisconsin about that again, of as parcels get smaller, how do we help bring landowners together so that we can still see management get done in a cost-effective way to achieve outcomes that are desired by that different set of landowners. It's more difficult for sure, but when you see the benefits that can be produced, it's worth that investment to try to help landowners work together to achieve something that benefits everybody.
Could you update us all on some of the economic trends of the wood products industry in northern Wisconsin, like what species of trees are increasing and decreasing in value, and what is the wood being used for now?
Well, Scott Bovey will probably correct me here as he's standing in the background. Yeah, I should probably just have Scott answer this question because this is his thing. So I'll answer it. I'm going to give you an answer, and Scott will give me a grade. Okay? So, first of all, again, a comment I made during my remarks about the fact that Wisconsin has a really robust forest products industry. So I'm going to start answering your question by not answering it. And the thing I want to highlight for folks here is we may take for granted when we're most familiar with a state like Wisconsin about what it means to have a robust industry. But we work on, we have programs in 42 states, and there are a huge chunk of those states that have very little forest industry. So let me give you an example. Colorado has a fair amount of forest land, right? Colorado has one commercial sawmill in the state. And as a result, and it's got a lot of dead trees and damaged trees from insects, mountain pine beetle, for example, and then fire damaged species, and they have this huge fire risk, and they're desperately trying to get acres treated. So you can imagine someone who's got 10 acres of land that needs treatment. If you were sitting here in northern Wisconsin and needed that treated, someone would be willing to pay you to take care of that treatment. In Colorado, that 10 acres would cost you $25,000 on average to have that treatment done, for something that, if you're in a place with markets, you could get paid for here. And that's something we take for granted here, I think, too much, and that's why it's really important as we think about the importance of all the forest land in the state and how it's managed. One of the key linkages is not only is this important to the economy of rural communities, but it's actually important for the ability of landowners to implement management that helps achieve their objectives and often other objectives, and often sometimes help landowners be able to keep their land as well. And so I never want to lose sight of the fact of you don't want to end up in that situation that we didn't appreciate it till it was gone kind of circumstance. So, so anyway, and we're working on the markets issue in other places around the country. So we're really, again, fortunate in Wisconsin to have a vibrant. Are there opportunities for improvement? You bet. In terms of one of the things, Wisconsin continues to lead the nation in the production of paper. It's been 65 plus years now. I lose track of the dates that we've led. And there's a lot of interesting historical reasons why that is. But so that's a huge sector of the forest products industry in the state. But it's a minority of the individual companies in the state. The vast majority of the wood products companies in the state are smaller facilities that produce a whole range of products. The diversity of the industry in this state is really remarkable when you look at the number of different products produced by often pretty small firms that collectively, last I recall, there was like 12 to 1,300 forest products businesses in this state. And I think 200 and some sawmills, if I remember right. Okay, we have over 200 sawmills in Wisconsin. Colorado has how many? One. Montrose, Colorado. I can even tell you where it is, right? Because there's only one. So, the appreciation for the fact that, species ebb and flow. Pine markets got really tight, for example. I remember Terry Mace used to work in forest products within Wisconsin DNR once said, at the end of the day, we often worry about what products the industry will use. The industry adapts to what's available, ultimately. And so, there was a period of time in this state where aspen wasn't utilized, but there was a lot of aspen. Industry figured out how to utilize aspen to the point at which then there became, quite a high demand for aspen. And there was a time period in which, basswood, no one's using basswood, and red maple, and so on and so forth. So I think part of the issue is markets ebb and flow a bit, but ultimately, as folks are looking at those who utilize wood, look at what's available, what's coming on, what does inventory information suggest, and how might we utilize product in that way. So, Scott, you want to add anything to that?
No, great answer.
A+. Any other questions?
Yeah, hi.
Hello.
Has there been a trend toward not in my backyard, hands off? Is it getting harder to engage? Social media, I'm sure, might be a help if you're able to get your message out. We have a state that has had a lot of restrictions lifted and a lot of changes to these laws that might not be in our best interest. Are people that own these forests more inclined or less inclined to care?
So one of the things that's demographically happened with land ownership, if you go back let's just go back to the middle part of the 20th century. So quite a while ago now, right? If you looked at who owned the private forest land in the state, who owned the private forest land in the state? What was their profession? Farmers. Farmers own the majority of private forest land in the state. Okay, now they own a very small percentage. As we went from smaller farms, with the woodlots, et cetera, and now you've shifted to very large. So farmers don't own, I think it's 1% to 2%. It's a really relatively small percentage overall of the private forest land in the state. So, but as we had more people in the state who worked land, as part of what they were really familiar with, the dialogue you have with a landowner who comes from, say, who has a farming background, who's very used to the idea of working land, is a really different conversation than you have with someone who ends up purchasing or inheriting land, and they've lived their entire life in a city, for example, and their relationship to even understanding what it is they have and whatnot might be really different. So we've shifted over time. Very understandably, we've shifted from a closer relationship to land. We also have more absentee landowners than we would have had over time, where they don't live within a mile of the property. And so the nature of conversations about land and getting folks comfortable enough to move through this sort of spectrum of moving from awareness and understanding, to sort of the commitment to actually and feeling comfortable. What that means is feeling comfortable enough to know what they want to do with their land so that it can achieve their objectives. That's a longer process for more people now than it used to be, simply because of what they're familiar with or what their relationship is. It's not a bad thing, it's not a good thing, it's just different. And so it does require a different way of relating to landowners, and it often takes a longer process than it may have taken when we're dealing with more people who had a closer relationship and understanding of the land that they had.
Question online from the Olson Memorial Library. What kind of a budget would a landowner need to get a plan for 10 acres in Vilas County?
What is the going rate, someone, for a plan in Vilas County? Anyone? We want to start bidding? We can do bids here and sort of do a little thing. Oh. They're negotiating back there. Did you figure it out? Not going to touch it, Tom?
I don't know, just going off of what rates are for MFL plans, I'd say somewhere in the neighborhood of maybe $10 an acre plus a couple $100 per base plan.
Can you repeat that, please?
Yeah, so he was saying, so often plans are done with a base rate and then a per acre. And he was saying a base rate of roughly a couple $100 an acre plus $10 an acre. Right, couple $100 plus $10 an acre for a plan. So someone can do the math.
I recently converted 80 acres in Vilas County into MFL status using a local forester. And as a comment, I think I paid about $800 for that service. It used to be available for free from the DNR. My question to you is, and it was harvested about 25 years ago, and the plan is for the next harvest to be in maybe another 25 years.
Okay.
What can your organization provide to me?
So, great question. So, I love context. So, context. So, first of all, the state of Wisconsin used to provide plans for free. So, this gets to an issue about the public policy aspect of all this. So, there was a debate about, help me out, 15 years ago, 10 years ago. There was this debate about whether or not the state should still provide free plans to landowners. Specifically landowners who were getting into the tax program because they were getting a significant tax reduction, and so therefore maybe they should pay for their plan. And part of this was a debate about workload, and the state had gotten behind because of huge tax law influx at the time on state land management, and so the legislature made a choice to say, no, we're going to shift. The plans are now going to come from the private sector, and landowners can pay for those, and there's a cost share that the state offers through the Wisconsin Forest Landowner Grant Program, Wiffle Gap, to help offset some of that cost, but that was a good example of a shift. So it gets to be that, what was that? That was a debate about the public's investment, what's the capacity of the private sector, what makes sense for a landowner to do, and does it dissuade landowners from getting in the program, or is the benefit great enough that they'll still get in? Okay, so that's just a piece of context for how that shifted over time. In answer to your question, what can our organization do for you? So the way our organization works is, again, we don't have, AFF does not have boots on the ground in states other than at a broad coordinated level. So what AFF does is the American Tree Farm System works through state committees that involve state. So Wisconsin, individuals that work in different entities, that can work for private companies, they can work for DNR, they can work for universities, and et cetera. So there are landowners on these committees, and they have connections then with resource foresters who can work with landowners who are interested in being part of the tree farm program. In addition, for these landscape projects, what we do is we look at local groups, because AFF's purpose is not to sort of get on the ground, all over the country. We view that, no, there are great organizations locally who can do that. What we do is we look at opportunities to bring resources to bear that can, and then bring partnerships together, local partners together, who can then do the work with landowners directly. So we sort of make a connection to, if there's an entity who believes it's a good investment and they see these outcomes are things they're really interested in helping landowners achieve these wildlife outcomes in a specific place, they're willing to make that investment. They often, AFF is a conduit to bring those resources to bear for local groups to work with and do the work with those landowners direct. So in some cases, that involves things like the work that goes on to get landowners interested, potentially to link landowners to opportunities that exist to get some additional assistance. For example, cost share programs, whether that's a state cost share program or a Natural Resource Conservation Service, NRCS, cost share program, again, where landowners may not even be aware they exist. It's making the connection to those landowners to help them get some assistance to get work done. In other cases, in some cases where there isn't forester capacity to help landowners, we've used resources to actually contract for forester resources to help get work with landowners. Again, the good news is in Wisconsin, there's a great combination of public and private sector investment that can be used to help reach landowners and help them through that process. And we're also then, as an organization, we work to influence, particularly at the federal level, because we're a national organization. So we work to influence organizations like the Natural Resource Conservation Service, NRCS, which has a very large cost share program, largely agricultural based, and looking at how that can help achieve forest outcomes as well, because that is part of what Congress identified as outcomes in the program. And so we work with them to try to influence so that we make sure forestry is well represented, so that forest landowners can have access to resources to help them implement important practices on the ground. And so those are some of the things that we do as an organization. And the other thing we do is we have information we bring to bear. So again, the benefit of being a national organization, we help get information to landowners, like through our tree farm program. We have information that goes to landowners that learn more about their own forest land, can learn about ways they can weigh in on issues that could affect them, whether that's tax policy, whether that's how legislation moving through Congress, for example, the Farm Bill, which influences forests and whatnot. So we also help engage landowners to engage with their own members of Congress, for example, to make sure forestry is not forgotten in debates about some of these policy issues.
Another question online?
Another question from the Minocqua Public Library. Does Wisconsin have forest watershed partnerships like many other states do? That would be a way to engage private landowners in community forest management.
Watershed partnerships. So Wisconsin has a lot of different partnerships, groups that have come together. I'll use an example that some of the American Forest Foundation has been involved in, along with two federal agencies, the U.S. Forest Service, and I see Paul Strong here from the Schwaming and Nicolet. With the U.S. Forest Service and Natural Resource Conservation Service I mentioned, did a project that involved a number of other partners, including the state of Wisconsin, including the American Forest Foundation, in working with to achieve conservation outcomes in the Lake Superior Basin. And part of that work involved not only work on public land, but looking at work on private land. So that involved getting partners together, and there's a watershed association that was involved there. So it's taking, again, local groups, and there was a resource investment by those two agencies that helped target some specific work getting done, some really great work, both from a wildlife habitat enhancement standpoint, protecting water going into Lake Superior. That is an example of benefiting that tied in both watershed associations as well as other groups coming together, some of whom may not have traditionally worked or hadn't been working together. In some cases, the ability to bring resources together that can bring other partners to the table to help get good work done. And that was, to me, a really good example of that occurring.
Paul, two things. Maybe you can comment a little bit on maybe some associations that landowners might be interested in. You mentioned the tree farm system. Is there like a membership fee if someone wants to join and get information? And you've mentioned wildlife a lot. How is wildlife a good tool for engaging landowners?
So in answer to your first question, if someone's interested in becoming a part of the American Tree Farm system, one can reach out. In fact, you can go online, and if you did Tree Farm or Wisconsin Tree Farm or Wisconsin Tree Farm System, you'll get a contact information. The administrator of that program, his name is Shirley Bargander, and can certainly connect you then with a resource professional if one's interested in becoming. One of the things about the Tree Farm program is it's a certified program. So, and third-party certification is something that grew rapidly in the last 15 years and is important to a number of industries in our state in terms of being able to produce certified product. And so the tree farm system here, not in all states, but in this state, is a certified system. And so that does come with a set of requirements for landowners as well. But again, a real positive way, again, of getting access to markets. And the managed forest law is certified under the American Tree Farm System as well as the Forest Stewardship Council. So, so that's one avenue. There's also the Wisconsin Woodland Owners Association, and Nancy Bozak is the executive director. It's based in Stevens Point. You can also look at Wisconsin Woodland Owners Association, or WWOA. Hopefully that's not a world wrestling something or other when you type it in. But that's another organization for landowners in the state that's very active. It's a number of local chapters too that one can get sort of tied into. With respect to the wildlife issue, what we find in surveys, and part of what we've done in each of the regions I mentioned we survey landowners. What are landowners interested in? What are landowners willing sort of to do? Getting an understanding of, ultimately we can say this is a priority in a particular place, but if landowners overall just aren't interested in that priority, you're not going to be successful. Again, where success lies is meeting landowners' interests and needs with the broader set of social public goods. And so when we do surveys, what we found is overwhelmingly wildlife is the issue that really moves landowners, that they're really interested in doing things for wildlife. When you actually look at the reasons why folks own forest land, wildlife often comes out number one or number two. Scenic beauty is often the other piece. And then there's sort of family heritage issues and so on. So wildlife is a key way to connect with landowners. And so when we do marketing to landowners, for example, I've used different tools and techniques, different messaging to landowners to see what really moves landowners. And wildlife messaging moves landowners much more effectively overall than any other messaging. So there's a real interest there. And again, lots of different types of wildlife, of course, and just because someone's interested in wildlife, someone might be really interested in birds, someone else might be interested for hunting reasons, in game wildlife, game species. So it can really vary, but broadly speaking, a wildlife message and theme is something that gets landowners really interested.
We have another question online.
Another question online. How about advocating for a tax credit on sales of parcels that aren't subdivided? It might help prevent endless forest fragmentation.
Oh, you don't want me to get into tax policy, do you? A tax credit. So, tax policy, I'll just broadly talk about, tax policy really affects what happens to land. And there's both property tax issues There's taxes that happen with, like in the recent tax bill, for example, there were some provisions that affect forest landowners in terms of the ability, how you handle income from forest land, whether that's capital gains and so on and so forth. So there's lots to tax policy. I'm not a tax policy expert, so I'm going to avoid sort of the specifics. But what I would say is pay attention both at the state level and at the federal level for how tax policy, people don't often think about, well, one didn't think about in the tax debate. How many of you thought about, I wonder how this will affect what happens to forest land? Anybody in the recent tax debate? No one but me? I'm the only one who thought about how's this going to affect forest land? Yeah, and tax policy affects forest lands. And the tax bill they passed will affect forest lands, actually. It wasn't done by design for forest land, but the reality is some of the provisions do ultimately have an effect there. So it's a great question. That's one to take up with the state legislature, I think in particular, and members of Congress about, is there something that one would do to, make an incentive or create an incentive for land to be kept together as opposed to parcelized. And that's a great outcome to sort of pursue. Every, of course, policy like that has consequences to it, and one has to think through what would be the consequences in terms of how that affects behavior. But also then what's the cost of it and who pays that cost is the other piece of that.